hidden treasures of the 119th Psalm. So today we get to do the might anointing of the letter Nun. And so just as thinking about that concept, we're talking about the anointings that Jesus gets. Well, literally every letter will get based on, because every letter is Jesus. Isaiah 11 shows wisdom, understanding, counsel, might, knowledge, and fear of the Lord, and delight in the fear of the Lord. So that's always the 7 of the 8 verses, with the 8th verse being the miracle verse. So that lands us on might today. So what is the might of the letter Nun? And boy, does this verse mighty, and you'll also find just a ton of nuns in the verse. So clearly the psalmist understood some things about this that are really remarkable, in my opinion, and I think you will agree with me at the end of this discussion that there is a tremendous amount of might in these words. So to read verse 108 in the Nun section, again, maybe I should say before that the Nun is the letter that I guess it's called Paleo-Hebrew in the old version that they used in the days of David Amalek or King David. They used it for common use. It was my understanding that the square Hebrew letters that we see today were the ones when they were writing something of the Torah, but for common use they used this other. And the Nun was a seed. And when you look at the regular Nun that's in the square version, you can see that as well. And the idea of faith is very much there, and the idea of the soul, because the soul is the nefesh. And the Hebrew sages of years have taught, and I think this is important to understand, in my opinion it is, that your soul is a faith machine. In other words, it runs on faith, which makes sense that the Nun would be a seed and that the soul would be the nefesh. And so we see all these things, and I'm sure that you can see the might of faith is pretty substantial. And so as we look at this particular verse, I'm sure you can see that all over it. So the way it reads in English, again, is, "Accept, I beseech thee, the free will offerings of my mouth, O Lord, and teach me thy judgments." Now, a really cool thing about this verse, number one, you can tell the format's a bit different than any other verse that I see in the Psalm. And also, it is the verse that the Jews repeat right before, on Rosh Hashana, they blow the Shofar. And they will recite this verse, if you know, and I might put it in my show notes that show the different blessings that they do before they blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. But this is the one that they do right before that, because they're looking for that might. They're pleading with God to accept their prayers, essentially, their faith. And so it's really cool. And they also teach that this is a quid pro quo. I guess that's the way you say that. I'm not sure, but it's like, it's making a deal with God. I'm going to do this for you if you will do this for me. And the idea is a very interesting one, something you got to be very careful with, from what I understand. If you've ever done it, you'll know what I'm talking about. But we're talking about vows, and apparently vows are important to your soul. Based on what we see throughout the Nun section, we see that vows are all over this, where we might remember in the second verse he swore. Well, here he's making essentially a vow, and the Jews compare this to Hannah's prayer, where, you know, Hannah said, "Lord, if you'll give me a man-child," if you go back to 1 Samuel 1, you'll see where she prayed, and she made a deal with God. If you give me a man-child, I am going to give him back to you, is essentially the deal. And here, you know, it's kind of cool that King David does the same kind of thing. He makes a deal with God, but it's for God as well as with God. So accept this, I'm going to give you these free will offerings of my mouth so that you will teach me thy judgments. So hopefully, you know, he can continue to grow in that relationship with God through those judgments, as again, we talked about in Deuteronomy 4:1, that this idea of living from a standpoint of being connected to God in relationship has just a whole lot to do with this idea of judgments. It has a whole lot to do with real life. Real life is being connected to God. And so as you think about this, have you ever met a deal with God? And it's interesting how that happens, that as I was talking about yesterday, that when I was afflicted from, I had this friend, and I've told the story before, that he was dying of pancreatic cancer, actually, and I had never witnessed to him. And so when the doctors told us that he was dying, I actually went out and I made this deal with God, and I did it. I didn't premeditatedly go, I need to go make a deal with God. That isn't how it happened. I just remember praying. I was so heartbroken that Johnny might die not knowing Christ, when I found out that, here I'd worked with this man for years and did not know where he stood. And when I found out that his own wife and his best friend didn't know, I was afflicted. I was like, how could I be? So I went out and heartfelt made a deal with God that I basically said, God, if you will give Johnny more time, I promise that I will either introduce him to you or help him to get to know you better. So, I didn't, again, that wasn't, I'm just praying what was in my heart. And interestingly, I was making a deal with God. I hadn't really thought about it until I actually heard Mendel Cohen is this unbelievable Jewish rabbi that I often listen to. And when he explains this, he explains it beautifully and talks about how the vow works when it comes to your soul. And there's a really neat thing that I also want to mention about this verse when you look at it in Hebrew, is that word beseech thee, that it's like saying, please, please God, please, which is kind of where I was when I was praying for Johnny that time, like, please. And that word, you might remember, we talked about in the mem section that the word how, this interrogative pronoun of like the big questions, was ma, which was a mem, and an aleph, which is ma, which is interestingly, you find that same ma, I'm just going to make that note, when it says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Well, that's that ma right there, okay? It's a big interrogative pronoun. Well, the word na, in other words, if you take a nun and you put an aleph after it, then you have this, that's beseech. It's like, please, nah. And it's like your soul is saying, Father, okay? Because you got the nefesh sitting next to the aleph, which is normally the Father. So you get this idea of, Father, please. And here the psalmist is making this wonderful faith. I mean, think of the power of this. The Jews clearly see that it's powerful. That's why they are saying it right before they blow the shofar on Rosh Hashana, the day of their Jewish New Year. I mean, this is a big deal. They're asking for God, and they're pleading. And they're saying, if you'll do this, then teach us your judgments. It's absolutely spectacularly powerful. And I hope, as you just study, look at this verse, I hope you're like me and you've begun to memorize this psalm, because as I go through this, right, you might go, okay, except I beseech thee the free will offerings of my mouth. What are the free will offerings of the psalmist's mouth? Well, you got 107 verses that you said before you say this one, right? And so it's kind of cool that you get here, and now you're asking, Father, please, all these things I've been saying, the 106 verses before this, accept them as a free will, and teach me those judgments that I might live with you. It's just a beautiful thought, and I really love this verse. And of course, I guess my soul can't help just to relate to the faith that's involved with what the psalmist writes here. And so I hope you enjoy this verse today on the 119th Psalm.